Hello, everyone. My name is James Donnelly, founder and CEO of the Casa Group, and welcome to Season 4, Episode 1. We're all excited over here. We didn't think Netflix was going to pick up the fourth season, but it looks like we're in business. I'm joined today again by Michael Bender, partner, board-certified attorney with K. Bender and Rembaum, and of course, Jeff Rembaum, also partner and board-certified attorney with K. Bender and Rembaum. Gentlemen, welcome back and thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad we got the contract negotiations worked out.
Yeah, I am too. I'm not sure that our revenue is increasing much on this. Jeff, I know most of our audience are familiar with your firm, but maybe just kind of give us a brief. Who are you guys? And
well, what's unique about us, James, as a law firm is not only do we have offices throughout the state of Florida, but we focus our practice solely on community association law. So there's no other practices that, so many law firms try to handle so many other types of law in addition to community association law. Well, we are 21 lawyers, 9 of whom are board certified specialist experts in the field, one of which is a board certified construction expert. And all we do day in and day out is community association law. We're very active at a state level with trying to influence and sponsor and get legislation sponsored through the legislature. My partner, Michael, is very involved with that. My partner, Robert Kay and Peter Mullengarden have weekly and monthly radio shows. You can tune in and ask any questions there whenever you'd like. The information is at kbrlegal.com. You can tune in to Rembaum's Association Roundup as well, where I publish an article, sometimes once a month, sometimes twice a month, dealing with new court cases and new legislation, how it's being interpreted, and most importantly, how it affects you at your association. And those are all complimentary. So you can come in and be a guest on our radio station and ask questions. You can receive the roundup. None of this matters if you're a client of the firm or not. We're just happy to share our educational experiences. Very excitingly, and to conclude a brief introduction, there'll be some really splashy news coming up, but the short story is we've opened a new office in Orlando as well, and there'll be a lot more details to come on that in the forthcoming weeks.
well, congratulations. That is very exciting news, and you're good partners to have on this webinar because we have a lot to talk about associations. Just want to remind our listeners the format. We do have the Q&A function. Please send in the questions. As moderator, I'm reading them all, and I'm trying to we can't answer them all, so I try and put them all together. And so you may not hear your exact question fed back to our panel, but certainly we'll make every attempt to. I also get often asked about our past episodes. We do keep them all on casagroup.com. Just hit resources, webinar, and choose the topic you want. The other thing I wanted to remind you is Michael and Jeff are sharing a lot of information today, but they're not in a position, if they're not your attorney, to be giving legal advice. I also want to say that we have listeners from all over the state and some from Texas. We're going to begin today a bit generally about reserves, but as we get into more specific and law, obviously it's going to be narrowed to Florida, and we even have municipal and local laws that are going to be relevant here. So our agenda today, basically reserves, what are they? Who should be reserving? We have a lot of HOA and probably more condo on today because the whole legislation, the SB 4D legislation, has really created the interest in that appropriately. But I did want to highlight that it's not just condos that should be considering HOAs or reserves. And then, of course, with the changes, there's going to be a lot of discussion about that. So we will move on to that as well. I did, though, want to start, Michael and Jeff, to get our first poll question up, just so we kind of know our audience. And that's simply whether you are representing a condo / co-op or an HOA. And while that's being answered, I just wanted to take a moment and send our positive thoughts to all of those affected by Hurricane Ian. I know Castle and K. Bender Rembaum have had a lot of clients across the state and have been affected by that. And we've been busy supporting. But as board members, it's incredible how it changes your life when your community's impact like that. So we support you. We're here to help as we can, but Mother Nature has told us who's boss once again. So Marinette, let's share those results. And we, by the way, guys, we have over 400 of people on here today. So these are very much statistically relevant. And as expected, more condominiums than HOAs, but this is going to work out well, basically in how we've allocated the time. So yeah, let's take those off. And let's jump right in here. Gentlemen, the whole Surfside tragedy, you know, it was obviously just unspeakable for those affected, but it just seemed to create a cascading, appropriate focus on reserves and laws surrounding it. But I really thought we should kind of start with why does I don't care whether it's HOA or whether it's in Florida or elsewhere, you know, why does one think about or consider reserves? And I'll just kind of frame it and throw it back for you guys for comment. First of all, we're board members. We have a fiduciary responsibility, regardless of the type of our association, you know, to make sure we're making prudent decisions for our community. And some HOAs don't have a lot of reservable common elements, but you guys know, we have clients with huge facilities and clubhouses, and those will have to be repaired. I really look at it as kind of a smoothing of the cost of repairs that are going to happen, capital repairs, over time. And if you don't do it, and it's just like your roof on your own house, if you don't put away for the rainy day when the roof comes, it's a big hit. So and obviously one of the things that happened on Surfside is they deferred, and obviously it ended in tragedy. But maybe I'll start with you, Michael. Just in general, how should a board look at reserves, kind of independent? We're going to jump into the laws and what's required, but more on principle. How should our audience be thinking about reserves for their community?
Well, and you point out correctly, this is really probably more in Castle's wheelhouse, because it's business. These are business decisions, and when they come to Jeff and I, and we'll talk more about the legal ramifications and the legal requirements. But I think generally speaking, and certainly post Surfside, I mean, there was a lot of talk post Surfside how the issue there was they knew they had structural issues. It was a battle over, and I'm generally speaking, because I don't know there's other issues, but generally speaking, they knew they had structural issues, and there were battles, several year battles over the way to fund it. And I think that, you know, and speaking again, very generally, the idea behind having reserves in place is to ensure that you're going to have the money on hand the board will have the money on hand to address the structural needs, structural improvements, etc., repairs, without having to determine, okay, how do we go about funding this? How do we collect the money? And that the most, you know, disliked word in the community association language are two words: special assessment. So I really think, yeah, so I think that became a big discussion point, and certainly what the House votes, the House, the Senate versus the House in Tallahassee focused on when discussing and eventually passing Senate Bill 4D, which we're going to get into in more detail.
Yeah, you know, I'm asked often, how often should communities have reserve studies done? And we're going to again come into the law, but I want to reiterate that there's kind of two paths for discussion here, and we're going to jump into the legal one in a minute because you guys are lawyers. But you know, I think any community that has significant common assets that need to be repaired over time should consider reserves and should consider reserve study. And even though the new law is talking about 10 years for certain studies, I as a manager, we really recommend 3 to 5 years. You should be updating your reserve studies to keep them relevant. One question before I move on to kind of the HOA world is, we had several questions come in about how we can invest reserves and whether there's any regulation around that. I mean, obviously most of our clients kind of do a laddered CD program. It hasn't yielded much lately, although interest rates are coming up. But very specifically, the questions are coming in. Are there laws around what we as a board can do with the reserves that we do have? Jeff, you want to take that one?
Sure, happy to. I also want to address your prior question as well, dealing with the fiduciary duty of the board to save for the rainy day and its effect on Champlain. It really created a perfect storm because insurers were already starting to pull out of the state of Florida. Then Champlain happened, and then even more insurers pulled out of the state. So some of the hoopla regarding Senate Bill 4D has to do with showing the insurers that coming back to the state of Florida is a safer bet than they might otherwise think, because we are now saving for a rainy day. You know you're going to have the expense. So why should Joe homeowner be allowed to reside in the condominium for 20 years, enjoy the roof, enjoy the elevator, enjoy the building and all of its common improvements, but never have to pay towards their upkeep and maintenance from a reserve perspective? So it sort of makes sense that now everybody will be required to put some money away for the expenses that we know are going to be incurred. It's not a matter of if when it comes to reserve expenditures, it's really a matter of when. So you know you're going to have the expenses, so you're saving for a rainy day. And we can debate whether or not individual association should have the right to present to the membership the opportunity to waive or reduce, and the legislation takes that away. We can talk about that some other time, but for now, it's very fiduciarily responsible. If you're going to invest those monies, and now all of a sudden, you're going to see, I think, over the next several years, a big push from the financial industry coming and soliciting board members, and probably you, James, and your managers, and us as association lawyers, to invest those monies. And there really isn't enough regulation concerning how those monies can be invested. I'm not really aware of anything that says thou shalt not invest in the stock market, but yet would that be a breach of fiduciary duty? I suggest to you it would be. Imagine if you had $1 million in reserves, and then we went through the debacle that we're experiencing right now. All of a sudden, your reserves are worth $750,000 instead of $1 million practically overnight. You just lost $250,000. You might even have lost principal. It's much wiser and much safer to be extremely conservative with your investing of reserves, because what do you think is going to happen when the money isn't there because the board made foul investments with the money? And now the money is needed. In today's litigious environment, it wouldn't surprise me if those board members were facing breach of fiduciary duty lawsuits. It wouldn't surprise me if there was a creative lawyer out there who tried to pierce, if you will, the corporate veil to get to the individual board member in an individual capacity, especially if that board member somehow was involved with the company that was doing the investing. Right. And we can go on with these combinations and permutations, but you have to be financially prudent with these investments. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with more. And I think it's great that we highlight this, because occasionally we do get asked by our clients, can we, should we? And it is odd that there aren't laws around it, but best practice would be you just don't invest in any kind of risk when it's reserves.
And I think that's coming in the future, James, as well.
There was a proposal. There was a proposal that was put out. I guess it was. I think it was 2021. It wasn't during this last session. 2021. There was a proposal out there to try to figure out ways to allow for safer, quote unquote, investing. Ultimately, I think there were, and CPAs were vetted, and certainly the lawyers and other industry experts. And at the end of the day, it did not move forward. And I think for a lot of the reasons Jeff just said, it would take a lot more vetting.
It probably would. I like the laddered CD approach, where you have one investment group handling the millions of dollars that you have in reserves, but they stagger it so you only have $250,000 maximum at any lending institution. So you still have some protection on the downside if something happens to the lending institution. And instead of having to track month to month 15 different lending institutions, the brokerage house that's handling this for you sends you one 8.5 by 11 piece of paper with all the results for all of that ladder. So that's called laddering the CDs, and it's a really smart approach. James, I imagine many of your clients probably do that already.
Yeah, it's our recommendation of probably 90%. Jeff, I had an appropriate Kirk put in a question. HOAs, does Chapter 720 address anything reserves, or can we just rely on association governing documents. And I did want to touch on that before we move to condos. I'm an HOA, I'm on the board. Are there requirements in 720 for reserves? And if not, then why would I have to?
Sure. There's no mandatory requirement set out in 720 for an HOA to have reserves. But if many associations, homeowner associations, have a word reserves on their budget when it really should be non-statutory reserve, to have the protected funds, if you will, at the homeowner association, then either a developer can create them on inception, which would be strange because most of them don't. They don't want the obligation. But now if they do, there's legislation that says they have the opportunity to set the amount of their contribution toward that reserve. So that's new in the law for 2022. But if there is an unprotected reserve, I've been on the board of my HOA for almost 10 years. You'd think I'd know better. When I got on the board, we had $100,000 in a quote unquote road reserve, but it wasn't a reserve at all. There was never a vote of the membership to create the reserve. So it was really a future pot of money for some other board to come in and want to build a new gazebo or a new improvement where one didn't exist. And even though the money was, at least in the minds of the members for a particular purpose, that board was free to use those funds however they wanted to. So we took a vote of the membership, and now we have a statutorily protected reserve. Those monies can only be used for our infrastructure items, the right-of-way, the roads, the lift stations, the gate. That's practically it, but we know we can go to sleep at night and not have to worry. If you want to use the funds for a different purpose, once you protect them, you can do that. But once again, you're going back to a vote of the membership. And it's a really easy vote to obtain, both to create the statutorily protected reserve and to use the money for a different purpose. And that's really simple. We need a quorum of the membership, which is 30% or less if it's in the bylaws, and then a majority of the quorum. That's it. You can talk to your association lawyer. If the monies aren't protected and you're in an HOA, you should absolutely think about putting forward to the membership. It's an easy vote to get. Once you tell the members, hey, this will protect the money so a future board can't squander it, somehow that resonates with the membership and they like that. So they will vote for it. It's just a matter of putting it out there. And that's really the gist of this. There's nothing in the law that says an HOA must have a statutorily protected reserve, but the membership is free to create it. And that is done through the board sponsoring it, if you will, for a vote of the membership at a members meeting. Get it approved, get it done, then it will be on your budget every year. Then you have the opportunity to waive or reduce if the board wants to put those opportunities forward from a year-to-year basis. Now, this is very different from the condo. I'm not going into condo right now, but the opportunity to waive or reduce, for example, that's going to be very different when we address condos in a few minutes.
Well, that's a great point. The question came in, what's the difference between statutory and non-statutory?
A non-statutory reserve is really simple. It's not a reserve at all. It's a savings account that you have misnomered with the word reserve for the board to use however it so chooses.
Just one point on that statement, which is true, but it's whatever board, the purpose the board chooses that they're authorized to choose. I would just clarify that. Because if like your gazebo example, which is
authorization in the documents to spend,
right? Because the gazebo example is a great one. Obviously, a lot of HOA docs don't have limiting language on board discretion to add improvements, and so to Jeff's point, that board could take that road discretionary fund and build a gazebo. But if your governing document, your HOA governing documents require some sort of membership vote to add an improvement, well, the board couldn't just take the money and do it. But Jeff's point overall is well taken, is that it's not a reserve, a quote statutory reserve. It is more discretionary to the discretion of the board with whatever they're authorized to use it on.
And Mike, to your point, it's really strange that in a condominium, you want to put something new that's a material alteration, unless the docs say otherwise, we're going to need the vote of the membership. But in the HOA, material alterations are controlled by the board unless the documents say otherwise. It's a very strange distinction between the body of condo law and HOA law, and very few HOA documents put constraints on the HOA board in terms of those expenditures and material alterations. So look out for that.
You definitely need to review those things with your legal counsel.
Yeah. The last thing on condos or on HOAs, I just want to highlight, especially with Hurricane Ian come through, landscaping as an example is not something that is normally covered by insurance, and it was probably the number one expense of an HOA in the storm. reserves don't just have to be for capital items that are, you in the traditional sense. You can create a reserve for landscaping. You can create a reserve for these increasing deductibles for insurance policies. So there's quite a bit of breadth in terms of the opportunity for a board to make reserves, but especially with the HOAs, we've got $1 million plus landscaping projects that are going to have to be done in some of our communities. There's no insurance and there's no reserve, so that'll have to be tackled. Yep. I think we should now flip over to condominiums. And Michael, yes. I know there's been a lot of focus on SB 4D, but we kind of promised in this webinar, what's the law now and what's it going to be? Right. Maybe start with what's the law now, because there are reserve requirements and waiver requirements, and I can see the questions coming in already, and I know you're going to get here, but up till what point in time can I waive reserves is going to be one. But let's just start with, what is the law today? Okay.
Yeah. And actually the condominium statute is basically it's juxtaposed against the HOA statute. As Jeff just explained, there's only statutory reserves in an HOA if the membership has approved them. Whereas in the Condo Act, statutory reserves condominiums are creations of statute. And 718 is very specific, and we're talking about the application, not Senate Bill 4D application, because yes, that is in the law of the land right now, but the impact on reserves will not, as we'll get further into, truly take effect until post December 31st, 2024. So for right now, the statute's very clear, and it has been. When a board adopts a budget in a condominium or a cooperative, they adopt the budget, they're supposed to be adopting a budget for operating to address what they anticipate to be operating expenses for the upcoming year, and then fully funding their reserves. And those reserves are under the original, if you will, or what we've all been used to, is for roof and paving, painting, and then any deferred maintenance item that's going to exceed $10,000. So you're supposed to have reserves, fully funded reserves for those items. And if a board decides, listen, we believe it's in the best business interest of our community to fully fund, then we're going to create a budget that's based on making sure we have enough money in these reserve accounts so that when it's time to redo our roof, when it's time to redo the paving or the painting, or say a water to cooling tower, for example, or elevators, which are going to exceed $10,000, and we're going to have that money. We're going to reserve those funds fully. We're not even going to the membership and asking them, which is legally within their right. I've always explained legally that's within the board's discretion. Politically, it's not always so popular. And so what part of what Senate Bill 4D at least did for the structural items is we'll talk about it, to remove that discretionary that discretion from the board. Good news, bad news, I suppose, for some. But the idea here is fully funded reserves is what the statute says, and that's how the budget should be created. The proposed budget should be created. If the board wants to offer the membership the ability to less than fully fund, either some kind of partial or a full waiver, well, then that's something that the board has to ask the membership to approve. And in the condo world, the requirement to either less than fully fund or waive requires a vote currently of a majority of the quorum. So you would need to know what your quorum requirement is in the condominium. And if the statute says your quorum will be a majority of all voting interests, unless a lower percentage is in your documents. And we have many condos who have lower percentages, especially the larger ones will often be a third, not a majority. So you would go, it's a majority of the quorum. So a simple example, you have a 100-unit condominium. If your quorum requirement is a majority, that would be 51. So if 26 of so you need 51 votes out of 100. And if at least 26 of those 51 vote yes to either the waiving or the partial funding, that has successfully authorized the board to adopt a budget now with the operating funds, and then something less than fully funded as the second part, or completely waived if that's the case. And so that's really where the current law stands with regard to all condominiums, regardless of the number of floors. Senate Bill 4D, and we can get into that, in a minute, but that has the impact on those condominiums that are 3 stories or higher. But that's where we are with condominiums. Statutorily, you are required to propose a budget with fully funded reserves. the board has the discretion to go back and ask the membership, hey, these are our operational items. That's going to be the same regardless of what we do for reserves. But if we reserve, it's going to cost everybody $100 more a month if we fully fund it. We're asking if you want to partial fund and only pay $20 more a month, or we're asking for $40, or however that's the business side that you guys work with them on.
One thing that came up in our discussion the other day, Michael, was with the insurance and other increases, just inflation and insurance is leading the way. Our associations, and especially condominiums, are seeing increases of 15% and more. And first of all, I wanted you to explain that 15% doesn't include reserves, and secondly, the fact that it's 15% doesn't mean that the budget can't go ahead. Can you just briefly respond to a couple questions on that?
Yeah. And then yes, James, that's actually a common misconception in the condominium budget world, because there's language in the statutes, and I've seen, quite frankly, several governing documents, that were created by the developer council, which parrot the statute. So it's right in their declaration, which talks in terms of if a budget is they usually say 115% of the prior year, but what we mean is 15% higher. Then there's some limitations on there. And what people have read that to mean, and we'll have clients who've asked us, oh, so our budget's going to go up more than our operating will go up more than 15%, or our budget will go up more than 15% because we're increasing reserves. Does that mean we can't do it because of this the language in the statute, or the language and so the first part of your question is, to clarify, and you said it, is that 15% increase in assessments does not include reserves. So that number one. Number two, what the statute actually says is, if the board adopts a budget where the operating expenses are more than 115% of last year's, or 15% higher than the previous year's, what that means is that the board is, and remember, as boards, condominium board members, all board members, when you're creating your operating budget, what you're tasked with is coming up with a budget that will address the anticipated reasonable expenses of the association for the operations. And so that's what you're putting together. And if that happens to increase more than 15%, as you correctly put, just the insurance line item alone is likely going to do that. Well, then now what that does is it triggers something in the statute. It doesn't make the budget invalid in any way. What it triggers, though, is it allows the owners to file a petition with at least 10% of the voting interests signing off on a petition that they want to propose an alternate budget, and they want a membership meeting to approve an alternate budget. So the only responsibility that the association would have would be to notice this membership meeting properly, minimum 14-day. The obligation on the petitioners would be to then propose an alternate budget to the membership. And then there has to be quorum at that membership meeting, number one. Number two, one, they have to propose the budget. Two, they have to get quorum. And then three, they have to get a majority of the membership to approve this budget. Not a majority at that meeting, but a majority of the membership to approve the budget.
Mike, have you ever seen it happen?
And in all of our years, we have never seen that happen. And here's the other point, and James, we were talking about this yesterday. As I mentioned earlier, the budget is your reasonable anticipated expenses. So let's use your perfect example. The insurance line item goes up 30%. If I'm that owner who says, whoa, that's crazy, I need to propose an alternate budget that will meet the expenses of the association. So under the presumption that the board is trying to address pull insurance out for a second, all the other line items, unless they're adding huge, buffers, which are unnecessary, most boards that I see are quite frankly, I should say most, but I think it's more likely where boards are a little too close to the line. They're not giving themselves enough room. And so then that's where they run into some trouble on the operating side. You want to leave a little bit of contingency in there. But with the insurance line item, which is huge, I mean, a proposed alternate budget is still going to have to address that 30, 40, 70% increase. So even the alternate budget's going to impact. So I've never seen it happen, but do understand, board members, the fact that you're going to have a proposed budget that will be more than 15% last year does not in any way invalidate your budget. Review it with your management team, contact your legal counsel, and get a written opinion that makes you feel better, but you're good.
Excellent. Jeff, we're getting a lot of questions on what does fully funded mean. Can you address that?
Sure. I like to break it down to its least common denominator. If we have a complex subject and we can't explain it so a 10th grader could understand it, then I think as lawyers, we're missing the boat, right? We have to, so really simple. We have a component with a 10-year life. It's valued at $100,000. We know in year 10, we need $100,000. The fully funding aspect, we'll look at two different examples using that as our predicate. So fully funded. Obviously, if we start at the very beginning, that means $10,000. So $10,000 a year for 10 years at the end. Let's hypothetically say we didn't save for 7 years. And now all of a sudden we are starting and we have 3 years to go. Well, now you're going to have to take those remaining 3 years and put it into the 10,000. You're going to come out with your number, what, $33,300 or so for the remaining 3 years, or 300 as the case may be. I got that math wrong.
If I can interrupt, Joe, I think this is important because someone may think, well, it's 10 years and I'm 7 years in, I should have 70 grand in there. But if you do a reserve study today and the asset's 100 grand and there's 3 years of useful life,
you're going to divide 3 into 10,000, right?
Yeah, so that's a distinction a lot of board members are confused about.
Agreed. And I also want to point out it is a very confusing term, fully funded. So it really means, have you put away the requisite funds this year in this year's budget so that you're on track for your target at the end? However, be aware that if you're reading articles from outside the state of Florida on reserves, the term fully funded has a different meaning. And I'm not going to go into it to confuse everybody, but in Florida, we have the term fully funded to mean exactly as we've just described it.
Excellent. Now, there's different ways that we can fund, different methods, Michael, often referred to as the pooling or the component method. Again, I'm sticking with existing law because a lot of these principles are just going to flow into the 4D, and then we'll do the nuances around the new law. But am I allowed to choose my funding method as a condo in Florida?
Well, yeah, I mean, the statute, the Florida statutes were drafted as a component, but then the Florida Administrative Code, which are basically rules that are created and amended by the Department of Business and Professional Regulations, the DBPR, have they included language giving the option of pooling. And just very, very briefly, straight line means, when I explained earlier in the condo setting, roof, paving, painting. If you had a line item for your roof, you had a line item for your paving, you had a line item for painting, that's straight line component. Pooling would be where you take those three components, toss them into a pool, if you will. And so then the money's, so if you needed $5,000 in your straight line, you needed $5,000 this year for your roof, $3,000 for your paving, and $2,000 for your painting, you would have a straight line component total of 10. In your pool, let's just assume the numbers are the same, you'd throw 10,000 into this pot. And the difference between the two is, in a straight line, if I have 5,000 for roofing and tomorrow I need to do the roof and I need 10,000, I can't borrow from the other straight lines without approval by the membership. In a pool, I have 10,000 in there, as long as the components that I need the money for are in that pool, the board has the authority to use the funds in that pool without having to go to the membership. I think that's the simplest way to put it for this purpose.
I think it is. And I really think the pooling method provides a lot more flexibility. No reserve study is perfect. No useful life is perfect.
Right.
And to have money sitting there in one reserve, because they get recalculated. One of the things that I don't think a lot of people understand is reserve funding is always self-correcting. Every time you do measurement, you say how much is left, how many years, and you start funding again. So the pooling method certainly gives you a lot more flexibility.
Agreed.
But the
And if I may,
calculation.
James, I just want to emphasize, and I know people have asked questions, and Senate Bill 4D has this structural integrity reserve study requirement, but just in general, reserve studies, at least I'm going to suggest, a reserve study is something that all communities should be doing, should have done, and should be doing, even when I know the statute says for the SERS, at least every 10 years. I think that's too long, personally. But if you are pooling, what I have always said, if you are going to be pooling your reserves, I don't think you can properly pool reserves without having a proper structure, a proper reserve study undertaken by a qualified reserve study company. And there are at least a dozen or so in the state of Florida who are well-versed, certified, et cetera, to do these. Those reserve studies go out 30 years on all the different components that you want to include in your pool. So in my example, where if that they said, hey, you only need 5,000 your roof, suddenly something comes up and you need to pull the 10,000 out, then your reserve study is going to be adjusted, like to your point, but it will tell you how much money you need to have in each component. And it goes out 30 years. And so obviously, and I know some people ask, hey, what about CPI? What about changes? Well, yes, you're going to have to. That's why this isn't a stagnant document. It's a living, breathing document, in my opinion, that you want to update and adjust. I would say at least every 3 years myself, which is based on just an opinion. It's not legal advice. But I had one client the other day who said to me, hey, so we've been reserving, but we had to pull funds out of we had a reserve study done a couple of years ago, but we had to pull reserve funds out of and they pool out of these things unexpectedly. So how do we know what we should be funding for fully funded reserves next couple of years? And I said, well, you need to have your reserve study updated. Update your reserve study so because what they put in, you had a project that was going to cost you $1 million, which they said you need this much money these years, but you had to do that 4 years earlier. So all this money that they wanted you to be putting in, you no longer need to put in because you've just done it. So that's going to reduce what you need for that one. But you also pulled money out that you're going to need for these other things. So have that expert reserve study analyst come back, excuse me, and update your reserve study. And that's going to give the boards and the management team the best guidance on how to ensure and Jeff's description of fully funded was excellent, how to ensure fully funded is being addressed. And then if you want to do less than fully funded and you're permitted to, you can discuss that. Not that that's recommended, but it's permissible.
What's the current law on frequency of reserve study in a condo?
There is nothing in the law.
Wild, wild west.
Well,
However, fiduciary, but again, go back to your fiduciary duty. Say you're just a simple 2-story condominium with 8 units. The need for a reserve study in that condominium is going to be very, very different than a 50-story tower with all sorts of amenities. And especially when you're pooling, those calculations become very difficult because it assumes that not all the components are going to go bad on the same day, and you're always going to have the necessary funds for when the component breaks, so you don't have to do the special assessment. These calculations really need to be performed by a reserve specialist.
And since we're recording, James, let me make this clear. When we were saying it's Wild West, there's nothing in the law. There is obviously something in the law. Senate Bill 4D did pass, but its reserve study requirement for 3 stories and higher is not mandated until December 31st, 2024. And thereafter is when you cannot waive or fully fund, but your requirement to have a structural integrity reserve study, which is a reserve study, is something that boards 3 stories and higher should be working on right now, communicating with the qualified experts to get that in place. Don't wait till 2024. Supply and demand. Start getting with your experts now, getting something in place maybe for next year or early 2024.
And I'd like to add before we move on as well that I had the pleasure on Monday. We have a 2-hour webinar, and I had an engineering representative, a banking representative, James, one of your team was there with me as well, who's also a licensed engineer. Fascinating conversation all about Senate Bill 4D for 2 hours in depth. It will be available. It'll be on our website at kbrlegal.com. And I think they're supposed to be done with the editing sometime today or tomorrow. James will get that to you as well. So it'll be on your website as a link. There's lots of good information out there on Senate Bill 4D. But if you haven't sat through one of these in-depth webinars, then please, board members, take the time to do that.
Yeah, and we're going to touch on some really high-level questions, but that webinar was really focused more deeply. We often get asked, and I'll repeat, all of our webinars by the end of the day today will be up on our website. And as soon as we get the link from Kay Bender Rembaum, we're happy to add that in as well. Okay, there's some questions coming in about can we spend money from the reserves on the item? Like if the roof reserve and I've got a roof repair, can I spend that money from the reserve on the roof? Jeff. I'm going to throw that one to you.
What was that question? Can we spend money on the roof?
Yeah, can I spend roof reserve money on roof repairs?
Well, generally speaking, you wouldn't want to use those monies for ordinary maintenance. Those monies really should be set aside for that type of maintenance that occurs. If you want to think of it in the reserve sense, something that occurs infrequently. Let's say we need to now replace the compressor and it's a $40,000 replacement. That would be a wise use of the reserves. To use the reserve funds simply to pay to the AC company to change the air conditioning filters is probably not within the context, if you will, of ordinary maintenance. Expected expenses. It's not reserves. It's the one-off expenses that really are for the reserves. And board members, oftentimes we hear, oh, we just borrowed the money from reserves. Board members, that's a breach of fiduciary duty. You have no authorization to borrow those funds. That's a membership vote if you're going to use those funds for a different purpose. There's no such thing as a short-term borrow of reserves and we're going to pay it back next year.
It's a violation of the
Get the
statute.
membership to approve it.
It's a violation of the code and the statutes. And unfortunately, even though you quote borrow it just to the end of the year, you pay it back by the end of the year. If you have a disgruntled owner who files a complaint with the DBPR in the condominium world, and they will, in our experience, they're likely to cite a violation there and have you pay them some money, make a consent order to make this go away. So please, Jeff, I'm so glad you said that. Please do not quote borrow. And I offer this, and I know your managers are well versed in this, but for anybody else on, and just reach out to your association counsel and get guidance, because doing these things when you're dealing with reserves have legal implications, and that's the reason why you want to have qualified legal counsel.
Yeah, I think that's why I asked it, and there were a couple questions on the board here. If I use my roof example, if I'm extending, our building right here at Castle, we said, well, we can do this, and you can spend 20 grand and it'll extend it 2 years. Or you can spend the 200 grand and have it all done. Well, I mean, that may be an argument that's extending the life and could be
right. And that's why I think you need to vote, because there are fact specific questions, and there's certain, because the reason we talked earlier, operating expenses, a line item should be in there for ordinary maintenance, regular maintenance. And so you'd have funds in there to address certain things. But I think, James, you make a very good point. There might be some fact patterns that where you're undertaking somewhat substantial repairs in order to extend the life of the roof, quite frankly, because to allow you to get insurance. And I had that situation come up. I mean, Citizens was letting some of our clients know that in order for them to get insurance from Citizens, they had to undertake substantial roof repairs. And we're talking, $10, $20, $30, $40,000. So could they dip into roof reserve funds for that? I think that's something worth looking into on a case-by-case approach.
Excellent. Okay. The other thing that's going to come up here, and I just want to address it, is I think the fear of the boards is frankly the unknown, be some uncertainty, because we think there's going to be some clarification of law, but most importantly, there's going to be some number we're going to have to fund, and where's that money going to come from? And my answer is quite simply, there's only three sources of money in an association: regular assessment, special assessment, and loans. And all of those, I mean, you should get with your management and your legal counsel and just kind of walk through that exercise. But that kind of segues nicely into, okay, here we are. We've kind of covered reserves in principle, reserves in HOAs, condos as it exists. And now we take this step into the unknown. And I just want to kind of hit some super common points. In terms of timeline, the first date I think that's important is the end of this year, when we have to report. Is that correct, Jeff? I'll throw that to you.
Sure, that's correct, but it's a very innocuous item to do. You can go to KBR Legal. We have a form you can print it out, send it to the division. You can go and Google it, and the division already has a promulgated online form, and all you're doing is telling them essentially how many buildings you have, how many units you have, and what county you're in. It's just a no-brainer. They want to get their hands on who's going to be affected most by Senate Bill 4D for enforcement purposes, most likely.
We have a lot of questions about, I'm 3 stories, I'm 2 stories, I'm 3 stories over parking, I'm multi-use. would it be safe to maybe do that report and even ask the department for some clarification?
You can
to-
ask all you want to, but you're going to have silence as your answer. And if you like silence, that's fine. That's a good way to accomplish that. They're not going to have answers for that right now. There is some talk about glitch bills and such dealing with Senate Bill 4D. I'll be publishing an article. If you go to Rembaum's Roundup, you can find articles. I've written a detailed article all about Senate Bill 4D, which you can find on our website. Or you can send me an email and I'll make sure you get that article. But in the next several weeks, probably maybe up to a month from now, I'll be addressing all of the little glitches within Senate Bill 4D that I would expect the legislators to hopefully take care of in this coming session.
Yeah, and I want to come back to the glitch bill if we have time, because it will really be pure speculation. We
know what the glitches are. The question, the speculation is.
Yeah, you know what, James, that might be good for the next episode.
Yeah, exactly.
We'll get
By
closer
the way,
to maybe see what
congratulations! Like 4 seasons. Michael and I are your guests on the very first episode of season 4. I just started season 4 of Game of Thrones, so we're in sequence with each other.
Yeah,
Wonderful.
yeah, it's got the same size audience too, Jeff.
Well, I don't want to. I really want to very quickly. The form, the way they wrote the law was all condominium and cooperatives should fill out this form. And then the first question is, give us the information if you're 3 stories or above. So the question was posed to the division. Do you want, if they're less than 3 stories, do you still want them filing it? And they said no, which I don't blame, but I don't blame them. But because all these other buildings, you'd write your association name and then you'd write NA and send it in. They'd have thousands of documents that just say NA, but that's not how the law was drafted. But really what they're looking for, and I think Jeff put it correctly, is they want Senate Bill 4D. They want to know who's impacted by Senate Bill 4D, because they do have to realize there is a labor force situation that they have to focus on.
And it's simple enough to do, even if you're below 3 stories, the way the law is written. If you want to be in safe land, just fill it out and send it in.
Right. Just put NA.
That's probably good advice.
And email it.
Next deadline. Now it's 23. What's the next deadline after the end of this year?
Well, if we're talking about the Structural Integrity Reserve Study, December 31st, 2024 is when you must have the study completed by. These are very important dates, and different lawyers, we're going to venture into a discussion where different lawyers may feel differently. So if you really need to check with your individual lawyer for the association. So what if you did you passed your budget because you're a good board and you did it in conjunction with your management company in September of 2024? You hadn't completed your SEERs yet. Now it's December 31st and the engineer delivers the Structural Integrity Reserve Study to you. Do you have to amend the budget to account for the SEERs in 2025? Practically speaking, there's nothing in the law right now that says so. So you would then have those calculations in your 2026 budget. Interestingly enough.
But just to back up one step, you asked 2023. I want to remind everyone if you're a high-rise condo.
Yeah.
If you're a high-rise condo, you still the deadline for the fire sprinkler retrofit or the ELSS requirement is still December 31st, 2023.
Sure
is. If you're a high-rise, 7 stories or higher, make sure you're communicating with your council and find out what your responsibility, and your management team find out what your responsibilities are with that. Because that's something that's sort of being like ignored, but that's still there. And there's also some elevator requirements that have to be put in by 2023. All these things that I know your teams are well aware of and making your high rises aware of, but just keep that in mind. But then, yes, December 31st, 2020. Sorry, Jeff, what?
I was just going to say, I wanted you to tell our listeners the date one more time for compliance with the ELSS. December
31st. Well, it's January 1st, 2024. So I just think it's easier to say December 31st, 2023. ELSS / fire sprinkler retrofit, that which was supposed to be 2016 was kicked down. Now it's 2023, and there's been no discussion on pushing it further that I'm aware of. We'll see what happens in the session starts in March. But then we're on the milestone inspection report.
That's another one
that all 3-story and higher condos cooperatives must do by December 31st, 2024. and the structural integrity reserve study needs to be completed by December 31st, 2024. So those are your deadlines.
Well, Mike, the milestone is 30 years from the date of the CO.
Yeah, there's
25
right.
years from
Yeah,
the date.
Thank you. If you're, I'm in my head, I'm thinking we're all talking about older buildings. You're correct.
Right. So I just want to make sure our listeners are clear. So the
No, good
milestone
point.
report is 30 years from CO, or if you're within 3 miles of the coastline, without getting into what a coastline is today, you've got 25 years to get it done. And if you're already at the 30-year mark, Mike, which is where I think you were going,
Yes.
then the deadline is December 31st, 2024.
Correct.
A lot to keep in mind here.
Yes.
And every 10 years thereafter.
And every 10 years.
And every 10 years thereafter. And so last night I had a question. We did our 40-year certification. We just finished our 40-year certification. What does that mean? And by the way, if you're in Miami-Dade or Broward, that's who we're speaking to, because Miami-Dade and Broward are the only counties that prior to the requirement for the milestone inspection, they were the only two counties who had an inspection requirement, 40-year and then every 10 years, a 50-year, 40 and 50. So I will say that to my understanding, there is no clear response yet on how the recertifications, the 40-year certs, or if you did the 40 plus 10, what their impact is on your obligations to do the milestone inspection. As of today, what I would offer is that you should be communicating with your engineers who are either doing or have done your 40-year certs or 40 plus 10, and ask them what more is required of you to comply with the milestone inspection. So that, because that is, I would hope that is likely much less than a full comprehensive. And this, of course, will depend on how many years have passed since you last did it. But in this case, they said, we just did the milestone 40-year. I said, well, you need to get with the engineer. Hopefully it's a very simple and inexpensive add-on to get the milestone. He said, but then we have the 50-year coming up. Do we have to do that now? And I'm sorry, the milestone, the 40-year was 4 years ago. He says, do we have to do the 50 in 6 years? And I said, honestly, I mean, my opinion is if you finish if you have a milestone inspection signed off today, then you shouldn't have to do another milestone for 10 more years. But will the county require you to do a 50 if you did the 40? That's what we need and I think the state's going to kick it to the counties on that. But that is, as far as the glitches go, that's one of the at least for Miami-Dade and Broward, one of the biggest ones I think that our condominiums and cooperatives down here need clarification on.
It's a great point. In fact, I have near the end of my notes, we can't forget municipal local laws as well. It's been especially highlighted in Broward and Miami-Dade. But literally, as you were saying that, Michael, there was a question that came up on the board. We've done our 50. What does that mean? But again, I want to just zero in on the dates because there's and Jeff, what you had said, we have to have our inspection and our reserve study done by 12/31/24.
Correct.
However, we may have already done our 25 budget. So
Correct.
The argument there being that,
and the law is not telling us we have to then go backwards and amend our budget to account for the reserve study. Maybe that happens in the future, but right now the legislation is silent on that. So with that in mind, more likely than not, you wouldn't have to account for your SEERs in the budget until the 2025 budget season. Well, actually, no, the 2026 budget season.
Right.
Forward a year on
right.
that.
And again, I guess the way I say it, James, is for the listeners. So you're adopting your budget, let's just say November of 2022 for 2023. And the board, to my discussion earlier, board, you're proposing with fully funded, but if you want a less than fully fund, not saying that's a good idea, especially because at some point you're going to be fully funding. But if you want to do less than, you're posing that question to the membership today. They're voting prior to December 31st of 2022. So if now go ahead 2 more years, you're doing in November of 2020, October of 2024, you're proposing your budget for 2025. The law says after December 31st, 2024, you cannot waive or partially fund. So if you're putting the vote out in October of 2024, and you're approving your budget prior to December 31st for the 2025 year, you're good. It would be in 2025 is when you then could not even offer the membership anything less than fully funding if the law applies to you, and it hasn't modified at all since then. If.
Mike, there's no, if I understand it correctly, after December 31st, 2024, the condominium association no longer has the ability to present to the membership the opportunity to waive or reduce reserves. So if you were in 2023, you could take that vote before December 31st to get that done for your 2024 budget. But if you're in the hard deadline is December 31st, 2024. So as long as you do your votes to waive or reduce prior to that date, you're
Correct.
good to go. But if you
For the
try
2025 budget, yes.
right, if you try to do that vote after December 31st, 2024, you're dead in the water.
Right. And that's it. And just so where Jeff's coming from, because we have many clients who will have their budget approved by the board in like November, but their annual meetings in January. So they will do the vote at the annual meeting in January and then retroactively apply it to the budget because they're sure they're gonna, well, that won't work anymore, guys. That won't work if you do that. So you need to have that vote take. And again, I want to emphasize, we're not suggesting you should even be voting to do less than fully funding. You need to be working the math. And if you have been waiving all these years, I suggest you start at least partially funding over these next few years to ramp up to where you need to be. But Jeff's definition of fully funded, I hopefully clarifies it. That doesn't mean you need $100,000 here today, but you're going to need to work it out where you need to have that money in. So,
well, I think that several people asked the question, what is the last time I can waive reserves? And I'm not sure that's the best question to be asking, but the answer you have answered, and that is
right.
December 31st.
Prior to December 31st, 2024.
Yeah. And there will be no way around funding reserves in 26 based on that timeline.
For the again, and let's remember, again, we're talking 3 stories or higher cooperative and economic. This does not apply to the 1 story or the 2 story. Or those other 3 examples, which I don't know, they threw that 3-story.
Right,
I'm not even going to go there. Just if you, because the first question we were asked is, I'm a 2-story. Do I have requirements to do a reserve study? No, you have no statutory requirement to do a reserve study now or post 2024, unless the law changes.
Good idea, though.
Of course, it's a great. You should absolutely. I mentioned that. I agree. All of you should be doing reserve studies. That's the only way I think that's the best way for you to ascertain. And there were questions, can we as board members, we have accountants on the board, etc. I mean, the answer is, can you? Yes. Can you go ahead and get bids from contractors and use those numbers? Sure. Those are, but I do think the expense of a reserve study is one that you should consider budgeting for and getting it done because it's well worth having that baseline.
Hey, Mike, I just noticed the time and I know we're running short, so I did want to let our listeners know.
Yes.
Allison Hertz, Allison Hertz from our firm is going to be doing another webinar just tomorrow on a very similar subject, all about budgets. So
yes, and I will read it if you will.
Questions answered, or that would be another opportunity.
Perfect. Yes, and she will be covering several topics, a deeper dive to help your condominium association budget planning. In addition to operational aspects, Allison's going to discuss reserves and how insurance trends and the new building safety legislation will affect your association budgeting. So there is a link on the bottom of that last slide. You also can go to kbrlegal.com and find that link and click in. She's doing that, I believe, at noon tomorrow. And there is still room to join. It is via Zoom. And so we encourage you to get further get further with Allison tomorrow.
There you go. James, to you.
Okay, guys, we are out of time. This has been very good. I think, I know we're going to have another session when we get some clarity on the glitch bill, but I do think we should leave our audience with 2 thoughts. One is the intent of the bill is not going to change. The glitch is to clarify. And 2, we should really be asking the questions more, when can we start funding reserves rather than when we can waive them, because it's coming and we better get prepared for it. So thank you. You guys were great as usual. I appreciate you. I know our audience does. We had an unbelievable turnout today. And so I guess all we can say is to be continued.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Right.
Thank you again, James. Always a pleasure having you. Sub in.
Thanks everyone for joining us today. Take care.
All right. Appreciate it.
Everybody.